Okay, so I'm here in the garden at Trevecca University, and your fellow classmate Rachel is very safely socially distanced over there, and she's going to get to hear the review while she weeds the garden. So we're going to talk about what is agrarianism, who spoke up for agrarianism, what did they say, and is agrarianism just for farmers or country people? Why agrarianism is important for understanding and answering the ecological, economic, and social challenges that we're facing right now. So, we'll start out with defining it. Agrarianism is a practice and at a remove a philosophy that shapes its culture, economy, and polity around the limits, character, and possibilities of the land on which they live. Agrarianism is a community posture of adaptation to their local ecology. Such a community must necessarily believe that their life is embedded in a greater, more powerful, and more enduring land community or ecosystem. This belief inspires and returns to reverence, humility, gratitude, and awe. Such beliefs are the foundations for the practices of nurture, thrift, and conservation that permit enduring human habitations. Many indigenous communities in every habitable continent have practiced this in the past, and any community that does not accept the limits and practices of agrarianism is necessarily drawing parasitically on the life and wealth of the past, the future, or different localities, and often from all three. Empires throughout history have exploited other people across time and space for reasons of enrichment or survival or even ease. Empires exact the lifeblood of other communities. The backdrop of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is just such an imperial parasitism. The crushing taxation of the various empires that passed around the Hebrew people is that backdrop. Another example of imperialism is the exploitation of oil in the present age. The accumulated solar energy of eons past for the short-term benefit of a small number, brief period of time. Along with the ephemeral benefits to the wealthiest, this extraction is accompanied by dire consequences for present and for future generations. And those consequences are misery, death, and possibly extinction, certainly extinction for some creatures that have already become extinct. So this leads us to regard the relationship between agrarianism and justice. If our necessities are supplied from places we cannot see by people we do not know, it is difficult to assess the justice that is embedded in an article of clothing or a camera or a quanta of energy or a meal or a dinner table. Wendell Berry insists that if your necessities are supplied by people you do not know, you are not safe and you are not free. And we may add to that, and you are not just, or at least you couldn't know if you were. It would be an accident. Berry also makes the point that the longer the supply chains, the more easily they are exploited. On the other end of our supply chains were people exploited. Were people exploited or fairly paid? Was the earth honored or desecrated? If it wasn't grown locally or fashioned locally in our bioregion, how could one know? An agrarian society pays all its human and broader ecological debts in real time. It does not steal from the past or borrow from the future. An agrarian society does not presume to ask or force others to shoulder work that it won't do and for which it won't trade fairly. An agrarian society does not diminish the health and possibility of the world for future generations by taking more than their share or more than can be returned. This means that in the normal course of things, a locality will grow its own food, build its own homes, and fabricate its clothing using local materials, produce its own energy, That energy would be largely real-time solar, geothermal, and wind. Using and certainly needing anything beyond this limit would be collectively scrutinized, exceptional, rare, fairly traded, and worrisome. Import of minerals, food, clothes, energy, or labor that was regular, common, and cheap would be destructive to the essential fabric of an agrarian society. It would need to collectively face up to the fact that it was maladaptive. If that society had any memory or humility left, it would have to accept that if left unchanged, it shared a future with every other creature that could not or would not adapt. Extinction. As with all organisms, death is the fate of all societies. Destroying or exceeding their resource base is typically how they die. And that is the last point I will make about an agrarian society. If it's not agrarian, it's on its way out. So what does an agrarian society look like, and who are its prophets? In our readings, we encountered agrarian societies through writers like F.H. King in the book of Farmers of 40 Centuries. The impetus for King's trip through the three Asian countries in 1910 was the fear that the recklessness of American farmers, combined with its growing population, would lay waste to the land claimed by the United States in a matter of decades. Despite his efforts, the ruin King prophesied has continued unabated, though its consequences have been forestalled by the artificial respiration of tillage and the seasonal transfusion of chemical fertilizers. In China, Korea, and Japan, King hoped to find a living example to hold up to American farmers and to shine a light for a possible path into the future. This is exactly what King found. As you recall, King encountered societies in very different biomes: coastal, rivers, plains, hill country, and mountains. And those people had different practices based on their local conditions. However, each adaptation seemed very familiar, for they held common principles. Waste nothing, slow water, sink nutrients, compost manures, have many yields on a given land, intercrop, stack functions, use local materials, use human and other animal power, invent and adapt simple machines to aid production and transportation. Food goes to the local community first. Prevent all erosion at all costs, and if soil gets away, dredge it up from the river and return it to the fields. Those are some of the principles that we saw in all the different communities. They were applied differently to different ecosystems or biomes, but they were commonly held. These were the things that were articulated in Soil and Health by Sir Albert Howard, and in the One Straw Revolution by Masanobu Fukuoka. The life King describes in his book is spare and hard. I mean, what modern person would want to live like this? I mean, not me, but this is how China maintained such a dense population for so long. The cruel teacher that shaped this disciplined agrarian society was starvation. China had many brutal famines, nearly one every year since about the time of Christ. In one region or another, people were starving almost every year. There were some 1,800 between 0 and 1900 AD. So there's nothing like have to. Fukuoka holds out a less austere vision of sufficiency in his book and his philosophy and his farm. His do-nothing farming is poorly named, in my opinion, for it gives the impression that farmers work a little and then hammock a lot. And as he says in his book, this was not the case. But Fukuoka worked less than his neighbors and reduced the labor, the tillage or disturbance, and the fertilization by working with or getting out of the way of natural processes. And he did this to accomplish his goal. He uses nature's might to accomplish his goals, or the farm's goals. This would be picked up strongly by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren later when they articulated the permaculture principles in the 1970s. Sir Albert Howard, a little before Fukuoka, made a similar vocational journey as Fukuoka, converting from a lab hermit studying plant diseases to a farmer, keenly observing their land. This observation, for both of them, was the foundation of their adaptations. Howard's focus moved from disease to health. Health is the birthright of every living thing. If we invest in the health of the soil will take care of the plants will take care of the animals, the plants and the animals will take care of human health, and human health will take care of societal health. That was the pyramid that Howard articulated, this pyramid of health. And if any step below it were neglected, then everything below it would collapse, or excuse me, everything above it would collapse. Howard traces the decline and death of empires to the neglect of the health of the soil. Howard takes nature's examples as the teacher for human agriculture. How does nature farm? Well, these are some things he observed. Nature never leaves soil bare. She always farms with animals. She keeps large reserves of fertility and water. She always returns what was taken from the soil, sometimes more than she took. And that's the law of return, which is super important for all of this. You can't take more than you return, or it diminishes. It's just like a bank account. That's one law. A law that will not be violated, or if it is violated, it will definitely come back to bite us. Here Howard does what every agrarian people, every adaptive people have always done, which is watch and imitate nature. It would be silly to ignore the findings of a 4.5 billion year research and development project. In observation, we constantly are returning. One of the phrases that we share around here is that the best fertilizer is the footsteps of the farmer. That's a comment about walking around your farm and looking, observing. We can't be too much in our heads, in our own ego. We have to ask, is it working? And if it's working, we want to go with it and keep going. If it's not working, then we need to stop, change course, and respond to the feedback we're getting. So these are some of the people who taught us about what agrarian societies look like and how they functioned. And it is in fact a light forward into the world that is coming. Our last question about of agrarianism is, how would COVID-19 be different in an agrarian society than in ours? I just want to look at our current moment through the lens of what we've been learning. So it's pretty clear that the hypermobility of our modern society, the global travel and commerce, is a dangerous context for novel viruses. It guarantees that if a disease is anywhere, it will quickly be everywhere. If we had local businesses, makers, farmers supplying most or all of our necessities, then communities would not be spreading the disease to one another in the normal course of commerce. When a community lives within its ecological limits, it is able to and is required to leave wild places wild. When it squanders its resources, or when powerful parties take land from the poor, they are forced to clear wilderness in order to survive. While humans are pressed against those novel viruses, endemic to species that are unfamiliar to humans, they are also keeping animals in cramped conditions where those viruses can jump from wild creatures to domestic creatures and then to humans. And so these are some of the different ways in which our industrial society and especially with our industrial created a condition, a very we see the danger of having, PPEs, masks, and alcohol, and manufactured across the ocean. That when their country needs that thing, we're not going to be able to get it. Or when any shock to the system, like a failure in oil or a failure in the production of a famine, a natural disaster of any kind could stop those supply chains, and then where are we? We are deep into a society, a business culture that practices just in time. In order to, it's a practice that I've been about for 20 years, that businesses, instead of keeping big warehouses of stuff on hand, they order and they get it just when they need it. And that way that allows them not to have to store a bunch of stuff and all the cost of moving and storing all that stuff. They get it when they need it, and they put it into production, and they move it out the door. And it's much more profitable. It's a great system if your supply chains aren't interrupted. If they are, then that system begins to crumble. So imagine a world in which our energy, our food, all our necessities are supplied within our bioregion. And if they can't be, then we have to start asking questions about why. Are we taking more than we need? Do we have more people than we need to be right here? Do we need to start thinking about how many people can this place support? We have to be asking that question. And how can we be careful about how we use and return these kinds of things, these kinds of resources to the earth? So that's the bit about agrarianism. I hope it helped.